project-specific frameworks in this presentation. Hopefully you have already viewed and or read chapters 5 and 6. This will really build off of that. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Ingvild Ombudsved, who now by now you know well through her presentations in the previous chapters. Ingvild is the owner and founder of IOM Law, which is a CCUS boutique firm based in Norway. She herself has over a decade of experience in CCUS. And we were fortunate to have Ingvild join us for the book drafting. I do also want to recognize and thank our funder and supporter for all this work, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources. And with that, Ingvild, I will pass it back to you.
Unless you want to do some key takeaways from...
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll cover this. So this is an interesting chapter. It's called Project-Specific Frameworks. And you'll see a couple of case studies that Ingvild will get into later on that cover some actual examples of how at the project level, CCUS projects have been able to develop the necessary frameworks, even aside from a more broader overarching framework. But there's a couple of other topics covered in this chapter. Towards the end, we'll talk about project-specific levels where there's a suite of legal instruments that are relevant. You're talking about engineering, procurement, and concession contracts, pore space, land access contracts. So really, there's a suite of contracts at play here. And most of these contracts are about how you shift and allocate risk between the parties. Even if there's not a CCUS specific law regulation in a country, these suite of contracts often will refer to the laws and regulations of a country. And that could be, the environment, a specific environmental law that's at play, et cetera. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I think one thing that rises above in terms of right distribution in these frameworks is property rights. I mentioned pore space and land access. That's a common issue. Who takes ownership of the molecule as it moves across the value chain? If you're trying to seek carbon credits for this project, who has access to that? So we'll cover these and other topics in this presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ingvild.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you for inviting me to be part of that book drafting process. It was very fun. Learned a lot during that week, but I also am impressed by the editing work that was done at the end. I just have to say that because the drafting or making these chapters or making this book over a week required a lot of creativity and flexibility for the drafters and the organizers. And the contents of this chapter is a good example of how that all came together in the end. So this is also why you can see from the chapter heading that we're talking about project-specific frameworks, but as mentioned by Priya, and as you will see moving forward in my presentation here, is that a lot of what we're saying here or talking about in this chapter and in this presentation would not only be relevant for project-specific frameworks, but for drafting frameworks to begin with, and you can pull on a lot of the resources that we have in chapter 5, where we are putting out a proposed guideline or a six-step basis or a six-step approach for how to draft a framework, but also chapter 6, which provides a lot of information on different types of resources that you can use in the drafting process, and that drafting process and those resources will be equally helpful to you if you are drafting a regulatory framework for an industry, and if you are trying to amend or make modifications in order to facilitate for one or two projects, or you want to kind of do something as an intermediate phase. There are examples, and we will get back to that in the next slide, actually, of CCS projects being kicked off under current frameworks, but then having the country later on developing a CCS specific framework to kind of pick up on the remaining potential of CCUS activities in the country. So on this list, you will see a number of key considerations that you have to make when you are drafting a regulatory framework. And some of these you will face already in step 1 of the the roadmap on the way to your framework drafting. And that is, for example, the objective of the CCUS deployment in the country. So we are now very early phase on in the drafting process when you decide, why are we doing CCS? For which industry? Are we doing this mainly to support the fossil fuels? Are we doing this to support an important steel industry that we have in our country, and so forth? Some of these issues you will face in step 2, which is basically your gaps and barriers analysis of your national framework, because there will be a number of instruments in place already in your country that you can take into use when you are regulating this new CCUS industry within your national borders. For example, you might already have a well-developed framework for environmental assessments that you are using for other industries. Maybe that can be either repurposed or reused as is for this new value chain that you are intending to implement. There might already be a clear definition of CO2 in your legal framework, whether you look at that as a waste, a commodity, or if it's even defined as hazardous or toxic. And you might already have a clear regulation of property, pore space ownership. All of those issues might already be in place. But then again, you potentially need to implement specific regulations or guidelines or laws for example, how to monitor and verify and quantify the CO2 that is captured, transported, and stored, how you are selecting and doing site characterization of the geological formation that you're going to inject your CO2 into, and so forth. And in this process, when you're considering these options and regulations, you might have a look at step 3 in the roadmap for regulatory framework for CCS that we described in chapter 5, which is basically allowing you to look abroad, look beyond your borders, look at how the other countries doing CCUS have already solved this. Look at some of the resources that we have identified and described in chapters 6. So I'm kind of pulling you back a little bit to chapter 5 and 6 in order to remind you that yes, you can read these chapters in isolation, but I recommend you to read them in combination a little bit, and that each chapter is kind of building a little bit on the other ones. So even though they have very useful considerations, questions, topics for discussion themselves, they are stronger read in conjunction with the other ones. I promised you some case studies on projects that have been developed in countries with basically no CCUS specific frameworks to begin with. And many of you might have heard of these 2 projects that we have displayed here. Norway having been injecting CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf for more than 25 years in the Sleipner project. And the Sleipner project was deployed under the current, or the back then current, petroleum framework. So the CO2 is separated from the natural gas produced at the field, and then re-injected on the continental shelf for storage. And the Norwegian regulators managed to accommodate for this activity under the plan for development and operation, which is basically a part of the permitting process where the operator is describing how the operator is going to deploy their petroleum producing project. And in particular, this project came due to a CO2 tax that was implemented offshore in Norway, which would have subjected the operator to a tax penalty for emitting that CO2 that they were stripping from the natural gas they were processing. So by re-injecting it into the continental shelf instead, they avoided a tax, and they were able to continue producing their natural gas at the field and then sell it to continental Europe. later on, the Norwegian regulators have implemented a CCS specific framework after the implementation of the European CCS directive and other instruments relevant for CCS in Europe. And what we see today is they're basically working a little bit in parallel, so that the Sleipner project and other similar petroleum-related projects storing CO2 or stripping or separating and storing CO2 will continue to be regulated under the petroleum framework, although updated with the CCS specific provisions from the CCS directive, while CO2 storage activities conducted as part of other types of industrial emissions, like, for example, steel, cement, waste energy, and so forth, they are all regulated under the specific CCS or CO2 storage regulation. So it's a kind of interesting example of how you can both do a project prior to a CCS specific framework, but that you can also actually continue the activities in parallel with more up-to-date CCS laws. Japan is another interesting example, and the Tomakomai project is world famous for being a very successful demonstration project in Japan, being deployed under the framework at the time in Japan, which was not specific to CCS, but they, for example, used some of the provisions from the implementation of the London Protocol to make this project happen offshore in Japan. We know that after recently, Japan has actually made crucial steps in implementing a national framework for CCS, but this Tomakomai projects demonstrate that they were managing a CO2 capture, transportation, and storage project on the Japanese continental shelf using bits and pieces from different types of frameworks, making sure that they were able to permit, monitor, verify, and report numbers from the project, regardless of the lack of a CCS specific framework. This is it might be a little bit of a confusing slide, because they kind of say that you have 5 very clear steps in terms of legislation drafting. And if you take a step back and you look at that chapter 5 that we talked about regarding the proposed roadmap to drafting CO2 or CCS or CCUS specific frameworks, this isn't really a match. It's here you see 5 steps, and we talked about 6 steps in the past. What I want to emphasize with these 5 steps, they're kind of interlinking and interacting with those 6 steps as you go along, because some of these steps are part of the policy and strategy process by kind of choosing what type of instruments, what is the purpose, and so forth. But also, as you see here, there's an integration part, which should not be mixed up with the implementation step that we presented as step 6. The integration part is more questioning whether you want to make a new law or you want to kind of continuing doing amendments to an existing law and so forth. And these are all of these things you would have to kind of go through and discuss as part of step 4 and 5, and also 6 specifically in the CCS drafting process. But as I mentioned, you need to keep an eye on these 5 components already from the policy step number 1, because you want to make sure that if, for example, one of your intended effects of this framework is to make sure that you are continuing to support existing industry in your country, that the drafting that you do later on in the process are emphasizing that. It might be very benign, or of course it has to be this way. However, this is basically just a checklist to remind you that there are a number of considerations that you have to take, which is not necessarily related to the characterization of the CO2 or the geological storage site or the permitting process as such, but these are more general to all drafting of regulatory text. So we made also a decision tree on how you can approach CO2 regulatory drafting, and I'm going to hand it over to Priya so she can walk you through that decision tree. So take it away, Priya.
Great, thank you, Ingvild. It may be a little bit hard to read on this slide, but this is essentially a non-exhaustive decision tree. So assuming you have identified that there's a market, there is an intent for CO2 emissions control, and that control would be CCUS is one of the options for that control. Then you can start going through the decision tree. So on the left side, the threshold question is, are those emissions that you're going to use CCUS for being utilized? And are they being utilized within the country, domestic use only, or are they being utilized or do you have to export them to a neighboring country, and is that neighboring country utilizing them? So either way, you'll see that you get to the same decision point, which is some sort of utilization framework needs to be developed. On the right side, you can see, well, maybe utilization is one mechanism, but what about permanent geological storage? Maybe that's what you're planning to do for emissions control. In that case, there's a couple of questions that follow. So is the storage going to be domestic because your country has the domestic capacity or a resource to store? Or are you exporting only because you don't have sufficient domestic storage? There could be a hybrid where you do want to self-storage, but actually you have enough to accept excess storage, so you can accept neighboring country storage and actually receive their CO2 emissions. So in the case of self-storage or receiving neighboring storage, the decision tree leads you to developing a storage framework. In the case of solely exporting the CO2 for other people to store, then the threshold question is the storage going to be on or offshore? If it's offshore, then the London Protocol may get triggered. And you can take a look at the handbook for more details about, what makes it applicable for the London Protocol. If not applicable, or if it's onshore, then you likely will need to engage in bilateral agreements. But anyway, this is just an overview. And I think the key message that I took away for this framework is, in all cases, you can see the decision tree leads you to some framework is needed, whether it's a utilization framework, a storage framework, bilateral agreement. You can't really get around doing some sort of framework. The mechanism and type of framework may change, but a framework of some sort is needed. And hopefully the resources chapter in this book will help for that. Mention the key takeaways, project-specific framework. So there's a suite of agreements and legal instruments relevant when you're talking at a project-specific level. So examples include an EPC contract, a offtake agreement, transportation storage contract. You can see this is a non-exhaustive list, but it's very comprehensive. Similar to the resources that Ingvild had previously shared, those same resources, and there's also a chapter 9, which we're not going to present on. Essentially, it's a list of other resources and websites you can refer to after the fact. There's a lot of material out there where you're not starting from scratch. There are templates, EPC contracts, there are template concession agreements that you can use as a starting point to get to what you need. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this next slide essentially puts those list of agreements into a visual, and it shows you how they're all interrelated. Again, not all of this may be relevant. Maybe you have a fully integrated company where the midstream and upstream is condensed. Maybe you're not interested in generating carbon credits, so you don't have that carbon purchase agreement. But in general, some sort of suite of contracts could be applicable for a CCUS project. And you can see at the hub of all of this is the project developer. Interestingly, as we were developing this figure, there's a very similar figure in another CLDP Understanding Series handbook that we developed a couple of years ago, and that's actually on power purchase agreements. So if you look at the power purchase agreements handbook, there's a very similar relationship, and many of these agreements are the same. In a power project, renewable power project, you do have an EPC contract. You do often have a concession agreement with the host government. You probably don't have, a pore space access, but you do have some sort of access agreement. So it is interesting that, we're not talking, when we're talking about CCUS, we're not talking about starting from scratch. There's a lot of historic and existing know-how and knowledge that we can leverage from the energy and power industry. So, Ingvild, any closing remarks on Chapter 7 before we wrap up this presentation?
I think that maybe a point to be made is just that this might look a little bit overwhelming, and there's a lot of information here. And I think that a key message would be that, as you mentioned, you are not alone. There are resources, and we've seen especially that other countries, early movers, they are very willing to share information about how they've approached the regulatory process. And we have seen also, as you will see more in more detail in the resource chapter 6, there are the ISO standardization world. There is the London Protocol contracting parties that have all had some a number of guidelines. They are available also to support drafting processes and discussions and capacity building, and that there's like this there will be an ongoing capacity building internally as you go through the drafting process, even if it's a project specific framework or a CCS framework for an entire industry. You will have to develop with that industry and build your internal capacity as you move along. And maybe the final point here is that and I highlighted this also in one of the earlier chapters, that a framework is only so good as its project. So you can have a lot of instruments in place, you can do a lot of hard work producing a well thought through framework and borrow models and mechanisms and drafting procedures from others. But you have to test this framework on your national industry, on your CCS value chains, in order to see if it's actually fit for purpose. So I think that with that, I will hand it back to you, Priya, and thank you for the hard work on editing all of these complex issues into one very comprehensive and interesting chapter.
Great, thanks, Ingvild. So with that, we conclude the 3-part chapter of Legal Regulatory Frameworks, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Again, please take a look at the handbook itself because you'll get further deeper into the topics that were covered by Ingvild today. I also encourage you to take a look at the recording and the handbook for the next chapter, chapter 8, which is on finance and incentives. That's also a very critical piece of the puzzle. So thanks again to Ingvild, and also to our funder and supporter for all this work, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources.